As Tennessee begins the process of transitioning to these new science standards, science educators need to focus on some instructional shifts that will happen with these new science standards. For one, they need to focus on bridging the gap between the nature of science versus how it's actually experienced in the real world. Another thing is that they will need to begin to set expectations for performance rather than just through curriculum. They want to begin to build a coherent spanning of learning that goes from kindergarten all the way through 12th grade. And as they do that, develop an understanding and application of the content that they're learning. As we mentioned before, integration of those science and engineering practices will be the foundation of instruction. And to understand this intentional design to prepare students for college, career, and citizenship. English and math skills will also be aligned within the science standards. The changes in science can often be compared to the changes that happened with mathematical practices. Math teachers have already experienced these changes over the last several years, and science teachers will begin to tackle some of those understandings that math teachers had previous. So one of the math practices that are most closely aligned with these science standards are being able to reason abstractly and quantitatively. Students will also need to model not only with mathematics, but show that modeling through science and using and knowing when to use tools strategically. 3 other connections to math and mathematic practices that we have seen over the last several years that are now being applied to the science standards is that progression of knowledge that occurs at each grade band and allows students an opportunity to develop more complex materials. We saw this through the math standards and how they were changed, that students are not learning the same material year after year, but actually progressing as they move up through their learning. Another connection to math is a clear path of coherence, and that is that we can see from K through 12 why students are learning what they are learning and how that is developing the groundworks for the following year and the years following that specific grade level. Students will progress through the standards with the assumption that the previous years have been mastered. When looking at the engineering and science practices next to the math practices, you can see the similarities between the two. So as with math instruction, teachers should be looking for these math practices to be happening during learning. These are ways that students can demonstrate understanding of a topic. Are they reasoning abstractly? Are they modeling with mathematics? Are they using their tools strategically? Are they looking for and making use of structure throughout the lesson, throughout the unit? These are the things that are sort of embedded within the instruction, and as many practices as can be demonstrated shows teachers a higher level of learning and understanding. So if we take what we know with our math practices and apply it to the science and engineering practices, we should be able to see the same things. If we are seeing students asking questions and defining problems, are they engaged in an argument from evidence? Are they using mathematics and conceptual thinking as they are carrying out their investigations? The more of these practices that students can demonstrate, the deeper level of understanding they are attaining. With these new standards, we will also see connections to the reading and language arts standards, and these will also be embedded throughout. So as students are learning their science standards, they will be encouraged to engage and explore and evaluate and elaborate across content areas. Their reading and language arts standards already have these sort of evidence-based learning embedded throughout those standards, but we will see those embedded in the science standards as well. So another shift in thinking is your role as a science teacher. If I reflect on my own instruction, I would bet that I follow some of what the research shows. Research shows that only 6% of lessons are actually devoted to high levels of learning involving hypothesis generating and testing, and that most 58% was spent on just teaching new content. And that's sort of what we do as teachers, simply because we feel that these students come in not knowing anything, and we need to expose them to this new content. So with these new standards, we want to kind of flip that idea of just giving new content and allowing students to develop their understanding of new content. When we look at best practices in the science classroom, most of us are already doing these things. So that is the great news, is that we are already halfway there. So we are grouping students, we are allowing them to manage their ideas and informations, we are doing investigations, we are having students defend their arguments and explanations. So we're already doing these sorts of activities of best practice in the science classroom. However, we want to focus on a few key things. So the NSTA recommends the following guidelines for middle school level science curriculum, and that's to really emphasize the hands-on minds-on inquiry-based science instruction, and to really nurture curiosity about the world around them. Instead of that 6%, that needs to be flipped to 80% of instruction time should be devoted for students engaged in investigation. And obviously we want to encourage informal learning experiences by incorporating independent as well as cooperative learning, and use multidisciplinary approaches by integrating science with those other curriculum subjects. So we see a quote from Marzano and Toth that we should see evidence of students wrestling with new content as they build the stamina required to reach higher levels of thinking. Part of being a teacher, it's hard to step back and allow students to struggle. But one thing I learned as I was involved with the shifting in mathematics is that the struggle really is the learning. When we talk about rigorous learning or rigorous teaching, Robert Marzano, who has literally written the books for best practices, outlines some essential teaching strategies for teachers to help develop this sort of rigorous style of teaching. So now that we have taken a look at some best practices that we should be seeing within the classroom, I want to take a moment to talk about some best practices for science teachers. What do we want our science teachers to be able to do? The first one is that we want them to have in-depth knowledge of the content that they are teaching. We also want them to have in-depth knowledge of some common student misconceptions. This will help teachers sort of reroute some thinking or redirect some of those misconceptions that students may have about topics. Going through this process as a math teacher, having in-depth content knowledge was one of the best ways that I could prepare myself for my students. It also helped me to redirect some of those misconceptions with mathematics. So another best practice that we want for science teachers is knowing how to introduce and develop new concepts that actually build on what they already know. We want teachers to plan instruction that engages students by using a variety of those strategies and best practices that we saw in earlier slides. This will help learners make sense of what they are learning. Another is to understand student thinking and plan accordingly. This allows teachers to develop those deeper level questioning. It also helps to redirect misconceptions that students may have. We also want science teachers to assess formally while instruction is occurring. So teachers must have an equal amount of both content knowledge as well as teaching strategies. The next is deepening their knowledge in how to teach content. We get students that have many different backgrounds. We have students that may or may not have holes in their learning. We need to know entry points and how to get students to where they need to be per grade level. And finally, we as teachers need to learn ways that students learn and think. These are those teaching pedagogies that we have learned. These are our best practices, and how can we apply those to the science classroom? So let's start tying it all together. So there's 3 needs that teachers have in order to move forward, and one is to understand content. They need to not only understand the grade level that they are learning, but understand that progression of learning. So they need to know where their students have been in order to drive them where they need to go next. The second is to deepen their understanding and knowledge of how to teach content. Over the next several years, we hope that science teachers will begin to start putting some of this into practice. And it will take time, and it will be a process. Going through the standards and understanding how they will teach and how their teaching will change. Students need to have opportunities to apply and infer, and teachers need to have training that's grounded in modeling practices that support this. In conclusion, the best thing that was said to me during my process as a math educator was that there is no substitution for good instruction. These next few years are going to be a challenge, as they were a challenge for math teachers over the last several years, trying to make sense of these changes and piecing it all together, figuring out what works and what doesn't, taking chances. It's almost as though teachers themselves need to go through the engineering design process where they try something new and evaluate not just what their students are learning, but evaluate their own instructional practices. We want to see students engaged. We want to see teachers engaged. And it will take time to push students and teachers to the level of rigor needed to meet these new standards. They will do that through the progression of learning and understanding how the standards build upon one grade level to the next. And it will take some time, but over the next several years, we hope to make sense of these new science standards and take ownership for implementation. So with that, we need to understand that the struggle is the learning, both for students and teachers. Thank you.